today's video, we're going to do a build of a horizontal napkin holder. Now, there will be a second video of a vertical type if you like that look better. I am prototyping both for needing to make a gift for an upcoming celebration for someone. I would like to make it out of walnut and mahogany. In the end, I don't have the money to do my prototyping with those woods, so we are going to be using Home Depot pine. I will say right now, I am going to use the jointer and maybe the planer at one point, but you do not need to. And in fact, this is the second time I've shot this video after discovering a design flaw in my original one, and the pieces that we will end up using were done without the planer. They did use the jointer. Actually, this one didn't. This one was done totally without. So we don't need those. If you have them, it's going to make it smoother, easier, quicker, all of that. But don't worry, if you don't have a jointer and planer, this will be totally fine. So I would advise when you go shopping for wood, looking for something that's relatively straight from the box store. It's certainly going to help. But because we are going down to relatively small width pieces, any kind of cup isn't going to be that big of a deal for cutting the joints. So with that out of the way, let me talk about my thought process here. So I've got one main criteria. These will hold napkins. I am basing all of my dimensions off of standard 6x6 napkins. These are the cheap ones I get from Walmart. If yours are a different size, you're going to need to adjust to meet yours. I would like these laying flat, down, and able to be pulled out 1, 2, 3, whatever at a time. Like I said, the second video will discuss holding them vertically, but for now, horizontally. So 6x6, and I found that about 4 of these stacked is about 1/8 of an inch. So if you buy nice quality fancy people napkins, yours may be thicker. Now the problem with a lot of napkin holders, just very plain ones, is that they don't actually hold the napkins that well if you only want 1 or 2. It's very easy to accidentally grab a bunch, kind of unfold one as it's coming out because these are flimsy. So I wanted to look around and say, how have other people who have done this kind of approached this problem? When I'm building something for myself or as a gift, I am totally fine with going and looking at the challenge that other people faced and how they looked at something before me. If I'm going to sell it, I try to not do a whole lot of research ahead of time, and instead I like to do just a little and then add my own kind of transformation. But I'm not selling these, so I'm totally okay with having looked at some other people's solutions. And I found one that I really liked. Because these are going to be laying flat and because you will be removing some at a time, the stack will get lower and higher. And we are essentially going to be building a little-ish box to hold these, and then attached to the back will be this guy, which has just enough weight to keep the napkins held down. We can also pull it up and down to add more napkins should we wish, and I think it looks kind of cool. So that is going to be what our design is built around, is this functionality right here. However, when I saw a lot of designs involving this mechanism, a lot of them were just kind of open, almost like somebody just took a plate or something and then hot glued this on the side, or obviously nicer than that, but generally like that. And I didn't love that idea because the napkins, although they could be accessed from 3 different sides, they could just so easily move out if someone were to tip it a little bit, anything like that. Instead, I want to have it so that there is one direction you are pulling the napkins out. I know some people may not be a fan, and you can adjust as needed if you would like multi-access points, but I want a way that when I go ahead and stick the napkins in there, they are held in place on 3 higher sides with 1 low front side to pull through. So we will be involving a taper and a tapering jig I'm going to use here. It's going to help if you have one or can make one. It's going to actually be necessary if you want to copy this, if you have one or make one, but you don't have to do a taper if you want. You could also use the bandsaw and do something like that too, or the jigsaw if you wish. So in my testing, I found that 6x6 napkins, they're hard to keep kind of perfectly together. So we want our box to have a little wiggle room on both sides so that we don't have to align these in a stack perfectly and set them down. So we're going to come in, I'm going to show you the dimensions, and I'm going to show you the general concept drawing of this, and then we will get started. We're going to begin with roughly a top-down view. Now this will be a square. Due to the 6x6 napkin, I want to have a little room on each side. So internally, we want 6 5/8 by 6 5/8. I think you could go anywhere from 6 1/2 to 6 3/4 or up, and you would be perfectly fine. I'm going to split the difference mainly because I want to use 7/16 of an inch thick wood. I like the aesthetic of that, and that leaves me with a nice 7 1/2 external number. So like I said, it's going to be a square, so 7 1/2 by 7 1/2. The thickness of the outer pieces will be 7/16. So very basic, very simple, excellent. Let's look at a few different angles here. So like I said, this is going to end up tapering. Now I calculated that I would like about 2.5 inches in the back, and I'd like to taper all the way down to 3/4. I'm going to set the base inside in a groove. You can do a rabbet or rebate if you wanted. I wanted a little lip in front to hold some of them in there so they don't all come out. I didn't want it too high that we can't reach in there easily. I calculated 2.5 based on wanting to put roughly a 1/4 inch base, 1/8 of an inch up, and then enough room for 50 some napkins, give or take. So each side is going to be like this, symmetrical. We are also then going to again have the 7.5 by 7.5 square. 3/4 will be our front dimension here. So it's going to taper down to a relatively thin piece over that. So this angle is somewhat steep, but if you have a tapering jig or can make one, they're relatively simple. I will show mine. Extremely simple. It's going to be just 2 quick cuts and we'll be all done there, though it must be done in the correct order. Do not skip ahead and do this tapering cut before we do some other things, or else it becomes really problematic. So the first thing we need to do is mill up the wood. Now, in the end, we're going to be going 7.5 by 7.5 by 2.5. So we would like our pieces before we cut the miters to all be at roughly 2.5, even though the front one will be getting cut down much shorter. Just get them all to an equal 2.5, 7/16 of an inch thick, and something over 7.5 inches long. That way we get a couple tries at the miters in case our first cut has some chipping or tear out. If you go down to 7.5 to start and you get one shot at the miter and it's some tear out or chipping that you don't like, well, too bad, you're screwed, you're stuck there. Now, as I said before, I've already got my pieces because I already went through this once. So I'm gonna show a little bit of each step along the way that I took, and then you can see that. However, this is also the time where we have to decide how we wanna make our base. You, if you wish and have a planer, can start out with a solid piece of wood and plane it all the way down. Mine is going to be set inside of a groove, though like I said earlier, you can put it up in a rabbet. I'm going to go about a 1/4 inch thick, maybe a little over, a little under, something like that. Now, again, I like to save wood, so I'm going to take about 4 inches of this, just resaw it perfectly down the middle, whatever that ends up at, glue it together, and then I'll come back the next day, cut it down to size, and I'll have my base. If you want to just plane a whole thing down straightforward, have at it. But resawing saves some wood, it saves some planer wear and tear, and it just works out fine in the end as long as you cut it right. Now the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to take a 2 3/4 section out of this. I would take 4 if I were starting over, and then I'm going to take it to the jointer. I'm going to lose less material by starting smaller so that there's less of a cup. There's a decent but not terrible cup in this, but I don't need this whole board right now, so I'm just taking a section out. I would also, if you are doing this from the start, take 4 sections out of pieces. It'll take less off the jointer. It'll go easier over if you have a bench top, all of that sort of stuff. Before I head to the jointer, I'm trimming this knot off. I don't need this whole length, and these things do a real number on fragile cutter heads of any type. If you can avoid putting knots through your planer, jointer, anything with a very fragile, sharp edge, avoid it. If you do not have a planer or jointer or any way to flatten this, just skip ahead to when we go to resaw. You don't need this. It helps to have it. I paid for it, so I'm going to use it. It'd be a little weird if I never used it. Now before we resaw our pieces down to 7/16, you have a choice here. You can either cut this to final width 2.5, or you can leave it a little proud, depending upon the blade and the motor of your saw. Sometimes when it pulls out through the bottom, it's taking a heavy cut. It will leave the rough kind of edge a little bit, just the edge a little rough, and you may have to do some sanding. It's not perfect. So you can start a little over, resaw, then trim down, or you can go right now to final width of 2.5, resaw, and you're good to go. So that's up to you. I'm going down to 2.5. I think I'll be okay. And this is also where I am going to start doing my base. So I'm going to get about 4 inches out of here and then resaw it at the same time as I'm doing the other pieces. Now when it comes to resawing, this is relatively simple and straightforward, but I have a whole video on it. If you have a featherboard, good time to bring it. If you don't, that's okay. Now what we want to do is we want to pick a flat side that we can face in. So for me, that's going to be the side I jointed. If you jointed and planed, it'll be either one. If you have neither a jointer or a planer, but you've picked out a decent board, such as this, I did nothing to this. This is going to be the base split in half. Figure out which side is flatter. If you have a cup, so let's say you've got a cup, we want the hollow to be facing in this way for one major reason. If we put the kind of rounded hump in there and we're pressing over, it can kind of wobble a little bit, which is what we do not want. We keep one side towards the fence and flip it over and go through such that our piece is always 7/16 to the right. We do not want to be flipping around. We don't want to do that. And we'd like as minimal movement as possible. I find that if you put the hollow against the fence, it generally just stays put better rather than trying to kind of deal with this rocking on that way. So if you don't have a flat side that was milled flat, pick the flattest one, keep it to the fence. We're going to label that side so that as we go through, especially if you're doing a bunch of these, you don't have to think about it. You just know what side faces the fence. Just make a mark on both sides of it so that when you rotate it over, you know. I like to just write in on one side as well. Now this is going to be resawn at a separate thickness. For this though, for our sides, the 4 sides to this, we would like a final of 7/16 give or take. So if you were going to resaw this, then plane it, you can go maybe a 1/2 inch, something like that. If you were going to resaw and all you have is some sanding, I'd go just a little over 7/16. The thing we have to look out for, and it's usually not a big problem on thinner pieces, is that when we start to resaw this, it likes to kind of pinch on the top and the bottom, and therefore it can kind of pull itself into the blade and leave a slightly uneven cut on either side. There's just this kind of like raised side and you can feel it. If you're gonna have to do sanding, it's not terrible, but we'd like to have as little as possible to get to our final thickness, so we cut a little closer. If you're going to do the planer, 1/2 inch, somewhere between a 1/2 and 7/16, and you'll be totally fine. You'll just get right down there with the planer. So I'm just gonna set this up a little over 7/16 of an inch. Now the way we're gonna do this is on something that's like 2.5 inches, we can do this in 2 passes. Our first one is gonna be about 1.25 inches, an inch, something like that, depending upon the size of your saw. We're gonna run through, keep the same side into the fence, back through again, and then we will raise our blade to make the next cut just all in one. So what is that, about 1 inch? Put it up, 1 5/8 inches and you'll get it through. The less times you have to raise the blade and go through, the cleaner it's going to be. If you're really bold, you can make it all in one cut. I don't fully recommend that though. 2 passes is perfect for something this thick, though you can do as many as you want. If you want to go 1/4 inch at a time, be my guest. When you are setting the featherboard, make sure to set it not where the blade is right now, but where it's going to be. As in, you don't want to be here because when we raise the blade, it's then going to contact. I go all the way back and just sit right behind the furthest out point. I just think it's safer that way. Now the next thing we have to consider is how are we going to push this through? Some people use a push block and a push stick for everything. I'm a hand person up until the final pass. Even on this, for that first pass where we're about 1 inch or so, I push it through with my hands. And then on the final pass, since this is going to be a 2 pass, I know that when I go through, this thing is going to split and the outside is going to want to fall down. That's fine, except sometimes it gets a little close to the spinning blade and I've never had it kick back, but I don't want to find out what it's like if it does. So when I'm on the last pass, I grab a push block that is going to make contact with both sides. What we don't want is one like this, where we've only got contact on one side. We want one that is going to contact both sides so that when we push through, both pieces will be pushed through and we'll be totally safe. I also, like I said, use my hand on the side. Some people go fully through like this, and if you want to do that, that is perfectly fine. I have no problem. That will work perfectly fine. This is a rather dusty chip flying procedure, so if you have a dust mask and don't normally wear it, now is not a bad time to go dig it out. After you are done, if you have successfully done this, you should have 4 pieces that are 7/16. Either you pre-cut them down to 2.5 inches wide, or you can do that now, and they need to be 8-ish inches long. We're going down to 7.5, but it's good to start over with. Now you will get this offcut, and it's right in between the keep and toss. Scrap bin, no scrap bin. Now for me, I didn't plane the other side, so this isn't nice and flat, so I'm going to bin this one. This is not a scrap bin, sorry. I'm going to throw this one out. This is not a scrap bin one. If it's nice and flat though, whew, that's borderline keep, but be careful, you'll end up with a ton of these and you'll have no idea what to do with them. Unfortunately, it's not thick enough for me to really want to glue it together. I have a feeling it would just bend too easily and the clamps maybe even snap. If it was a little thicker, I'd be okay with that, but ooh. Now for this guy, for my base, I'm just trying to split this down the middle as close as possible. The closer I get to down the middle, when I glue it up, the less sanding I'll have to do, or I don't know, maybe I'll throw it through the planer, but probably not if it's relatively close. So I actually like to take multiple stabs at checking. If I'm in the middle, just take a little nibble out with the blade pretty low. And as long as it looks like we're even on both sides, that's good enough. We're gonna have to sand it anyways after we glue it up, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Again though, ideally we wanna keep the same side to the fence. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this split in half for a base. I highly suggest if you are trying to do this in any kind of expeditious manner, you go ahead and just glue these up now. Then we'll do the rest of it, the cutting of the tapers and all of that. And then we'll come back and we'll have this nice and glued up, ready to go into our base and glue the whole thing up. The next step while the base is drying is to cut the miters. We just want 4 pieces, 7.5 by 7.5, 7/16 thick, cut with miters. That's all we're gonna do. It's much easier to do the base groove before we cut the taper, and then we're gonna cut the taper and then cut the front piece to match in case our measurements aren't perfect. So we do it all at once like this, and then we start modifying our side pieces. If you cut the tapers first and then try to do this, you can't do one of the miters because it's now at an angle. So you have to do the miters now or you get into some trouble. And it's just easier to do the base groove when they're all one piece too. So don't worry about the tapers quite yet. I'm gonna search for that mythical 45 and we'll see if we can get there. Now, if you are doing this on expensive wood and it's for like the final, I highly suggest doing test pieces. I keep around a bunch of pine, but I keep around a bunch of scrap pine just to make test cuts, test little boxes, test everything for when I'm doing miters. That way I actually get the joints right on the expensive wood. In this case though, this is just a prototype, so I'm just gonna wing it. We'll see if we can get close. 45.1, 44.9. I've learned over time that these angle gauges all have some level of error in them, and so even though it says 45, it doesn't mean it's always correct, but that's the best we can shoot for. Oh, we are so close. Ah, got it. All right, we're in business. I've got a whole video on the dark arts of cutting miters, but if you are making either a lot of these or you plan to do a lot of miters, I highly suggest making a dedicated miter crosscut sled. I think it's much easier than on a miter gauge if you're doing a bunch of them to be able to hold with 2 hands, to go through, put a stop block, repetition, much easier. If you're only doing it once though, and all you have is a miter gauge, go ahead and do that. You can also cut a 45 into your crosscut sled should you wish to do that. I don't love doing that, which is why I have a whole separate one. The other advantage of doing a separate sled is that you can make this fence much shorter because we're on flat laying pieces. We're not having any cuts where anything tall is standing up. Now, if you're doing this on your final wood and you've got sides of grain that you want facing out, I highly suggest numbering and making marks of the general direction of the miters to keep it in track, or else you can get out of track in the wrong side, etc., etc. So go ahead and put as many labels and markings on these as you want to make sure when we go to cut, we don't have to think about it. We just put it down and cut. My general process is I cut 1 miter on all of them until I get an edge that has no tear out and is nice and clean. Then I go and I cut all of them equally at 7.5 in this case with 1 stop block. Therefore, we get a whole uniform square and it lines up nicely. If you're using a tear out prone wood or you're getting any tear out, you can either put a fresh faceplate on this with some 1/4 inch plywood, or what I usually do is just stick some blue tape right over the back end on the top, not behind it. And that usually deals with 95% of it, and you get a good enough cut to go ahead with the project. There's some dispute over the height of the blade on miters. I like to have the full tooth above the workpiece. Some people go lower, some people go much higher. I just have the full tooth above the workpiece. It's always worked for me, so I stick with it. All right, wish me luck. If you are satisfied with your first miter cuts on all four sides, you can do this now two different ways. One, 7.5, you make that one cut, that's one and done. But on a project like this, we have a little wiggle room. It could be a little longer if needed. So if you're not 100% confident in your ability to stop tear out, you could cut it at 7 5/8. If one of them goes wrong, then you can nibble the rest of them off and go down. This is a prototype. I'm going straight to 7.5. But on more expensive wood on a project like this, I would consider going a little over in case I need a second shot at all of them from some tear out. But definitely use tape if you're concerned at all. For aligning the miter cut, mark at 7.5 inches on the top of your wood and then transfer that line down and then either cut on that line or cut away the whole line, and that will get you correct. At this point, you should have 4 pieces, all 7.5 inch externally, 7/16 of an inch thick, with miters on all of them. You've essentially created a little box. Now I've got to wait for my base to dry, but once that's dry, we're going to cut the groove, and then after the groove, we will do the taper, and then after the taper, we will cut down the front piece, and it will all fit nicely together, and it will look good. And there is one small thing after that we can do, but you don't have to do, and it involves kind of tapering the front piece so that it all flows down. We'll talk about it when we get there. Quick question for anyone out there who knows more than me. I've had these 6-inch Bessies for about 5 years, and in the last couple weeks, the heads on 2 of my 3 have just started popping off. And that seems a little ridiculous to me that these have only lasted maybe 5 years. Anybody know why? Anybody know how to remedy this situation? I plan to go to Harbor Freight and buy more of theirs. I'm certainly not buying any more of these because I think it's a little ridiculous that I only get about 5 years out of a clamp and one of the integral parts to it just stops functioning. But if anybody knows, why is this happening, and is there a way to fix these? That would be great. Thank you so much if there is. I've got the base trimmed down to slightly oversized. One way you can always be safe is just to trim it down to the external dimensions of your pieces. Therefore, it's never going to be too short. And then we have something closer to the size we're working with. One thing I always kind of advise here is that if you're sanding something down, you can easily round over these edges. And if we've not pre-cut this to something rough and we've rounded those over and then we go to try to fit, it's going to seem like it fits. And then when we go to cut these off, it's going to actually be thicker. So I always like to sand to the second to last grit, then do the fit of the testing to get the groove right, and then one final grit sanding, and then it's done. We've got a little room in there for expansion and everything is perfect. I apologize earlier for not mentioning this is a perfectly fine time to use plywood too. 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, if they make that, 1/2 inch, whatever you want to use. I like doing bases out of solid wood, and pine resawn and glued together is much cheaper than plywood for me, so I always do that. But if you want to rock with just some 1/4 inch plywood or something, this is a relatively lightweight, we're not carrying much here, absolutely go for it. You will be able to skip the entire step of having to glue this base together. I'm going to bring you in closer and just quickly show you the layout for the groove. I went a little overboard sanding this, so it's a little thinner than 1/4 of an inch now, a little too thinner than 1/4 of an inch. Normally on pieces this tiny, I'd hit the router table. I think it's just easier with tiny pieces, but my smallest router bit's 1/4 inch, so we're actually gonna go to the table saw and get a more accurate fit that way instead of it being too loose. Most of you probably have a table saw, and many of you probably don't have a router table, so this will be perfectly fine for you anyways, and I'll show you how I do the setup on the table saw. We're going to need to bring all 4 pieces and our base to the table saw. Now in terms of blade selection, if you have something that's a flat top grind, so a ripping blade, Diablo doesn't do theirs flat top grind, but if you have something flat top grind, it's going to produce a smoother bottom. Most normal Diablo blades, or I think all of them actually, are alternate tooth bevel, which means the depth of the very top of the tip of the tooth is not actually the depth we're going to be able to set the piece in there. It actually is going to be the depth where it ends up coming down and making a flat thing. So if we want to have a 1/4 inch deep, we need to actually go a little bit deeper than 1/4 inch so that our base sits in at 1/4 inch. I know that's weird, but if you've ever done a groove before and you know that kind of like jagged bottom, you'll know what I mean. And if you haven't, just trust me on this, I guess. So if we're doing, I don't know, 1/4 inch or so deep here, maybe 3/16, it doesn't have to be super deep. So if you're using an alternating tooth bevel, the ones that have the pointed tips on them, go a little bit over 1/4 inch or 3/16. Again, it doesn't really matter the depth. One of those two is fine. I wouldn't go less than 3/16 and I wouldn't go more than 1/4 inch. as we're working with only 7/16 of an inch thick wood, and we won't have a ton to play with if we go any deeper than a 1/4 inch. In fact, definitely don't go deeper than a 1/4 inch. The way I like to line this up is I just initially raise my blade to the depth I want. So I'm gonna go just a little under a 1/4 inch because I've got a flat top grind blade. And I personally like to cut the groove on the outside. I like to keep my table saw fence as far away as possible from the blade. None of these fences are cheap no matter what saw you have, and they're not easy to replace. It's a terrible thing to mess it up. I like to have about 1/8 of an inch or 3/32 on the outside, this kind of little lip that this is sitting in here. And I like it that thick to give it a little bit of strength. Any thinner than that, especially on like a pine or some kind of thinner or weaker wood, it's a little sketchy. You can chip it off and then it's a total mess. So I just take a mark. I actually mark on the outside here. Let's just call it about 1/8 of an inch up. And I'm gonna align that with the outside of my blade, the left side of my blade. And then I know exactly there is where I'm going to start. And everything from here on will be moving the fence closer to the blade to make our groove bigger. I just like starting further away. So we're essentially gonna just, get a rough look here, a little over 3/16, something like that. We're gonna make a pass on all of them to establish our kind of outer edge, and then we're just gonna keep moving it over, going with a pass each time of all 4 of them until we get a nice fit. Now, we don't want a super tight fit, partially because if you were using real wood, solid wood, I'll say, we can get some cupping. This is a decent enough wide board here, even resawed and glued together, that we could possibly get some cupping. We also don't want to trap this in there if you're using solid wood. You want to get some expansion. So we're going to look for just enough that like it sits in there, but it can kind of just move just a little bit. I'll show you up close once I get it correctly so you can see, but we don't want to have to like push it in there super hard or mallet the base in there. We want it to just lay in there, and we're going to pin it with a little glue in a certain spot, but it's essentially just floating in there. It's a floating base. So let's go ahead and do this. Again, 1/8 of an inch or so, 3/32 to the left of your blade, that much of your wood. And then we're gonna cut on the right, and we're gonna move the fence in towards the blade with every pass until we get that fit. All right, I've got my groove done. Let's look at the fit here. We want it to be able to just slide in there. It can move freely. We've got a little room on either side. You can see there's a little cup in this board, but it's not too bad. That is what we're looking for, because we gotta be careful of any expansion and contraction of any type. This is relatively thin on the bottom. We don't want it to crack. And all we're gonna do now is trim this guy down to meet these 2 ends. You don't even need to measure anything. This is the distance, and then we're gonna subtract a 1/16 total to give us room for expansion. That is all we need to do. No measuring required. Just stick this guy straight in there, and because this is a square, we only have to do it once. And just mark those 2 little corners where you're at. Cut that plus a 1/16 of an inch off, and you will be good to go. If I line this lid perfectly up with the other end, this is just about right for how much extra space I'd like in there. Right around the 1/16 of an inch. We want that amount in there when this is touching the other side down here. That way we know we've got expansion and contraction settled both ways. If you are going to be doing any staining of the base, or you want to do any kind of pre-finishing, go ahead and do it now, because we're going to end up gluing this up pretty soon after we do the tapers. You may have to wait overnight or whatever, but just go ahead and do that now so that it's all done when we cut the tapers and we're ready to glue up, and you don't have to wait even longer. And then be careful with this. Don't dent it, chip it, because it's not going to be able to be undone. We are now ready to cut the tapers. Now, if you have a tapering jig, that's going to make this part a lot easier, whether big, small, whatever it is. It'll be easy. We'll set it up once, and then we'll cut both of them. They'll be identical. Boom, bang, done. If you need to do it some other way, the bandsaw or a jigsaw or a Japanese pull saw and then a little sanding, you can either do them individually or do one, get it perfect, then flush trim the other one to match it on the router. Something like that would help, and that would work very nicely. Those are kind of your options. Coping saw, I guess, or whatever saw. Ideally, they're identical, because when we cut the front piece, we want it to match up. But if they're not identical, you can always sand it after we cut the front piece, which will be matching to the lowest part, to then match the front piece, and you can do it that way too. However you do it, it's totally up to you. If you haven't built one of these yet and you don't have a jointer, these make a great straight line rip jig to do some edge jointing for glue ups or just to get your boards nice and straight. So definitely a jig I would have and I think should be in every shop, to be honest. Now the alignment of these is going to be pretty easy because we are just going straight down from the side. So we're going to mark one of these at exactly the back top. We're going to go all the way to 2.5. And then I'm doing 3/4 on the front. This can be up to you. I want it fairly low so that only like kind of the bottom napkins are held in there, but we can still get to them relatively easily. I didn't want it fully open in the front, but I want it low, if that makes sense. So I'm going 2.5 to 3/4. And to line this up, relatively simple. You just carry your line down the side and then set it up to match the edge of the jig. And we want the line to be on the inside or directly flush with the jig itself because we're going to be cutting on the outside of the jig, if that makes sense. If you put your line on the outside, it's going to cut more than you'd like to do. So line perfectly flush or slightly to the inside of the edge of the jig. We'll walk through this and we'll get it done. If you have grain direction that is in straight lines and swooping down at all, I think that always looks nice as the side. So we're going to pick two different sides that are going to be opposite each other. Obviously, they're going to mirror each other. We know we've got our height in the back is staying fixed. All we're going to do is just going to measure up, in my case, 3/4 of an inch. Where is that? Right there. And you can see we'll have a little extra room to have the lip going over the front where the napkins are still in there, but they won't be too low or the front won't be too high. And then if you want, you can carry that line down just for a nice visual representation. You don't have to. And that is going to be the taper I am cutting. Now, the easiest way to line this up is to carry this all the way down to wherever you want it. We'll just eyeball it and say right there. And that is what we're going to be looking at when we go over to the tapering jig. And again, likewise, we'll know on this one that we're just going to this point right here anyways, so that's nice and easy. I'm realizing now I should probably pull out my small parts tapering jig for this, but we have two steps here to get a nice clean edge. First, we want the offcut to be on the outside, ideally. That way, we don't have anything fall into the saw blade. And again, remember, we're going to be looking at this mark that we've drawn, carried down this line on the inside, and we're going to line it up either exactly with or slightly inside of the edge. I ride this directly up against the blade, so I know I have that reference surface. If yours is in a miter gauge and offset at all, you're going to have to factor in the offset. And then we're going to line up the top of this directly with the top of this or slightly inside, but ideally this is directly with the top. And remember, we're going to this outside edge here. We're not going to this edge here. So it's a little bit tricky. And if we make a bit of a mistake and cut this a little short, we will just trim the back piece and make it look like there's no mistake. All right, once we've got it where we're happy with it, we are going to lock this down, and then we are going to essentially make a small template so that we can just slide the other one in so we do not have to try and line the other one up identically. So for now, we're just going to lock this down in here. We're then going to go grab, we'd like some tiny blocks of wood that we know have a true straight edge on them. I always keep a few around. So things like this right here are going to be great. We are going to kind of butt these up against the piece we have in there we're happy with, hot glue them down or double stick tape them down, and then the next one can just slide right in there. We don't have to do any measuring. 2 of them at minimum. If you can get 3, that's even better. We're then going to bring this guy right over here. We're going to get the hot glue on, and what we're going to do is essentially place these and hot glue them down so that when we go and slide our next piece in there, it just perfectly sits in there. No measuring required, no alignment required. It just sits in there, hits the reference face, and all done. At this point, this is what we should have. These should be hot glued or double stick taped in place. And there's one thing I want to say before you cut, especially if you cut and just get going. These two need to be mirror images of each other, not just identical, but mirror. So let's say you've got it in there like this, and the bottom is facing in. If you were to just slide this one in the same way, they would both be identical, but not mirror images. You would have the base, they would both be right-hand sides or left-hand sides. What we need to do is whatever way this is in there, so on this one, bottom down, the next one has to be flipped over the other way. If you do not do this, you will get identical pieces, but they will not be mirror images. So make sure whatever you do to flip these the other way. Put as many markings on here as you need. I've made this mistake before. It's absolutely soul crushing when it happens because you've got to make another piece then somehow and it takes forever. Now I use a ripping blade for this when it's this angle. It's debatable what you want to use here. You can use a crosscut, a rip, 40 tooth, whatever. The closer it is to a rip, the lower the teeth and the cleaner it'll be. If it's more acute and it's getting closer to a crosscut, go ahead and put a crosscut blade in there. You just have to use your own judgment. For this angle, I'm going to go with the rip blade because it's closer to a rip cut than it is a cross cut. Well, I just made a critical error, but not fatal. Maybe I'll see this when I'm editing this earlier. I measured 5/8 of an inch instead of 3/4, so it's going to be a little lower in the front than I'd initially thought, but it's not fatal. It'll still work totally fine. It's a little lower. Double check your measurements. Measure twice, cut once, right? All right, anyways, gonna pull this out, and now we've got, this will be the left-hand side. So again, we want these to be facing in on each other. We cannot set this in the same way or else it will not be correct. So that one was in there like that, which means I'm going to put this one in here like so, and then therefore they will match up. You have to do this. Do your best to butt these up as close as possible. You know, if I had started this direction, I would have realized very quickly that that is not 3/4 of an inch, but I just gotta let it go. I just gotta let it go. It's fine, whatever. If you use MDF for your jigs, these come right off and it's awesome. It doesn't ruin the jig. Plywood, it sticks a little bit more than that. And as you can see, we now have our mirror images. We are on the home stretch. Let's see if these line up. You know what? That's not bad. We're gonna trim that down to match the angle, so we'll be okay with that. And then of course, we're gonna cut this guy down too. At this point now, you've got your two sides, your back and your front. And you're probably gonna, put it together and look at it. And you're gonna say, hey, wait a minute. This little back thing kind of hangs over. What did I do wrong? It's ugly. Nothing. We now have to take this and match it to this angle. And then when we trim this down, we need to match that angle as well. You can do this a couple different ways. I personally just measure it using the piece itself. Now remember, my measurement was off because I mismeasured. So my front is only 5/8 instead of 3/4. My back, basically 2.5, right on, maybe a 64th under, whatever. 76.5 degrees if you are following my dimensions. If you did 3/4 like I was supposed to do, it's not going to be that. You can either transfer it to a gauge like this, or just take this entire thing over to the table saw and stick it under the blade and just line the blade up with that. And we're going to bevel this right down. What I suggest is you can try and one-shot it, but you can also try and get really close and then just kind of little sanding block finesse before we glue together to try and match that up. And this front guy here, obviously for the original directions, 3/4 for me, 5/8, I'm going to rip this down closer to the 5/8, so probably like 3/4, and then do the bevel cut. I think it'll be easier that way than trying to line it up with just the full thing sitting there. So hopefully that makes sense. So either take this and just line it up with your saw blade, or use an angle gauge and take that, and we're going to carry it over to the bevel. If we want, we can also do some test cuts to try to set it up correctly. So if you want to go that route, feel free. I should also mention that if you just want to do this with like a block plane ahead of time, or even hand sanding ahead of time, and you either aren't sure to get that angle there or don't feel as comfortable about hitting it and you want to just kind of go along the way with the block plane or hand sanding, totally fine. I would advise, or caution at least, about gluing it together and then trying to match it. And the main reason is that it's going to be going cross grain. So if you're sanding and you're using a low grit, there's a good chance you're going to put some deep cross grain scratches in that way. If you are using a block plane and going across, it can be very easy to take a chunk out of this if it's not a super sharp blade. So if you're going to go that way and do it after you glue it all up, just be very careful. We can do a little tidying up after we've glued it all up, but we don't want to have to be doing a ton of, well, the entire beveling after if we don't have to. For doing this bevel cut, I mentioned there are two ways. Either you're going to do it by transferring this onto a bevel gauge, angle gauge, and then coming over and setting it up, or just take the piece and just set it up in there and move the blade over until you don't see any light at the top or bottom. Remember, most blades have kind of like a slight hollow in the middle. So a lot of times when you're trying to line something up in a straight line, it'll actually be light kind of down the middle of it. We just need touching at the top and the bottom so that we know we've got a contact all the way through. We just need to be close. We can always do a little finesse sanding at the end, but we just need to be pretty close. Now, what we don't want to do is way overshoot this and lose a bunch of material here and then have to go back and remove material from that and back and forth, back and forth. We'd like to get this pretty much dead on, or at least pretty darn close. Even if the angle's not exact, we'd like the back height to basically be exact, or at least matching whatever yours came out at. Maybe you overshot a little bit on your taper and it's a little lower. Whatever it is, we want it to try to match at least the back height. We can always alter the angle with some sandpaper a little bit if need be. If you haven't done this in a long time or ever before, and you have scrap wood lying around, this is a really great time to grab some and do kind of like some setup cuts so that when we go to actually cut our workpiece, we know we're basically exactly correct. If you don't want to do that though, I highly suggest sneaking up on this and doing it in multiple cuts so you can just kind of tap your way with the table saw fence there. If you're not quite sure how to line this up at all, make sure when you put this down that at least the top edge is clearly not going to come into contact with the blade. Run it through once, turn off the saw, move it up kind of here, and then you can get a look at exactly where that blade is cutting in relation. It's often easier just to kind of sneak your way over, and on that first cut, you get an exact look at where the engaging of that blade is with the wood to know what your distance away is. So before I cut this, let me just give you an example of this so that you don't have to just take my word and try to figure it out from my words. Let me bring you over. We're just kind of like, well, I don't want to overshoot it because overshooting it is, by law at least, is the worst case scenario. So let's say we've got our test piece or even our work piece. Well, if we line it up like this, we know for sure that blade is not cutting any farther over. We can just take this pass right here and just see where we're at. And if need be, we can just tap this fence over until we finally get what would be right about there to probably get this dead on. Not quite sure, but back from here behind the camera, that looks like it'd be about right. But if you're not sure at all, start it farther away and then just tap it in and you'll eventually hit it. If you did this correctly, that should now match up pretty much perfectly and you're all good in the slope at the top. Now, we need to talk about one specific thing here from when we do the front. The height we are cutting to is from this back inside corner, not this front corner. So the top of your slope needs to match the height on the inside, not the outside, or else it will be too short. So just remember that when you line it up, we are going with this higher inside point, not the outside one. I've made that mistake before. I do not want to make it again, and I certainly do not want you to make that mistake. One thing I want to point out when we go to cut our small piece, and I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but I hopefully did, and if not, hopefully you're watching this before doing it. Because these are, again, mirroring each other, we don't set them down the same way on the table saw. For the back one, we want the angle sloping in towards the box, right? So we will set the side with the groove down on the table saw if your table saw is a more modern one where the blade tilts to the left. However, on the front, we want the groove facing outward. So we will actually then sit the piece with the groove up on the table saw for the front cut. It's just imagine mirroring them like that. We want them both going the same way. So therefore, groove is up on the front piece, groove is down on the back piece. Now, before you tilt the angle of the table saw differently, back up to 90, just kind of rough piece it together and see if everything feels pretty flush going all the way down. And there's so many projects where this can be used. If you've ever wanted to make like a letter carrier that has a larger back and you want it all sloping forward, just follow this same example. Anything where you want something contained but you want easy access in the front, it's a great way, and it's such a smooth look to have that angle carry all the way down. And like I said, the height of this front piece is the height of this inside corner right here, and the height of this back piece is the height of the outside corner right here. It's very important to make sure that those are your distances, or else you will have too short on both sides. I would also like to say that I'm going to discuss one option of attaching the hanger over in the back that I don't think I'm going to do, but I think is an interesting option. And if you want to do it, it's probably easier to do it now than later, although you could do it later if you wanted to. At this point, if you are happy with how everything meets up nicely, go ahead and we'll do the internal sanding. My only recommendation is when you're sanding miters, you need to try to take an even amount from all four sides so that when they glue together, they meet nicely and it doesn't look like there's a weird gap where one's thinner. Sometimes if one's thinner, they will kind of slide a little bit during gluing. I'm going to do the external sanding later in case I have a gap or some tape residue. I don't think there's any reason to do it now. It's also possible that you could do the little top sanding now, but sometimes when you're gluing something this small and using the tape method, it kind of has a tendency to pull it a little bit if you yank super hard on the tape. So these may end up being just slightly offset at the very end, and you're going to have to sand it anyways. So I'm only going to do the internal. I'm going to stain it, so I'll actually be gluing this up tomorrow. However, that brings me before all of this to the one idea I had regarding this. Now, I'm currently planning, and I will attach this to the back, just directly on there. I'm going to kind of feather down the sides a little bit, I think, to make it look a little more interesting. And then I'm going to glue it, and then I'm going to dowel it after the glue is dried. I think that's perfectly fine. However, I think if you were doing a thicker version of this, as in your material was thicker, maybe the whole thing's bigger and thicker, it would be an interesting look to put a bit of a dado in there and have this inset a little bit. We can't really do it with this because this is only 7/16 of an inch thick, and we also cut this groove in 3/16 to 1/4 inch. So at this point down here, there's not really much material there to go in. So for the most part, this would mainly be sticking out anyways. Now, structurally, you're going to get better kind of glue surface contact if you were to go into a dado, but this is a napkin holder. It's not being carried up a mountain. It's not going to get a ton of kind of roughing around. Only once in a while will somebody even have to lift this to put more napkins in. So I think gluing it to the back and then 2 dowels in there is going to be perfectly fine. But I just had that idea. If you want to set it in a groove, go ahead and do that. Just watch out for the depth that this is at so you don't go too deep. The stain is all dry, I'm happy with it, and I'm ready for glue up. Now, if you remember, my original dimensions had this front piece at about 3/4 of an inch. I accidentally cut it to 5/8, so I don't have a ton of surface in front here to stretch the tape around. So I've done smaller miters than this before. For a little post-it note holder, I went through a phase where I wanted to kind of miter everything, but they were all the equal same size here. We've got a bit of an awkwardness where these are higher and we still need something to pull. So we're going to start with the wrapping around the bottom, and then I'm just going to go back and I'm just going to put some layers of tape pulling, and as long as it looks good, I think that's fine. Looks good in terms of the top pulling together, I think we'll be okay. Now, anyone who's watched my videos of anything mitered, you know I do about a 3-to-1 water to glue pre-soak ratio on the end grain. I paint everything on, especially on something this tiny, so I just kind of paint it on the end grain, watch it soak in. We're trying to pre-fill the pores so that our glue doesn't all disappear in there. We need, for the actual glue joint, some surface-to-surface contact with glue meeting it. If we just apply this and don't apply enough, it will, a large amount of it, just soak right into the pores, and you won't really know for sure, but it could be quite weak. After looking at this, I think I'm going to definitely spline this, mainly because this is so short in front. At 3/4 of an inch, you may not have to. I wasn't originally going to, at least on the prototype, though on the final I may have, mostly for looks. But we're definitely going to spline this now. So if you want to do that, you can follow along too. After this is glued up, we'll come back tomorrow, or I'll come back tomorrow, and we will spline it up. And before this is dry, we'll move on to the back hanger thing. Well, I don't know what to call it, because we don't really need this. We just need the dimensions of this to work that out. So you can glue this up and directly move on to the plunge thing. What are we going to call that? I don't know. If you have a good name for that, let me know. So let's glue this up. So the layout for this is pretty simple. We just line them all up along some kind of straight edge. If you need to, use your fence on your table saw for this. If possible, that's a pretty good straight edge. If you don't have one otherwise, a level works great, of course, or even some kind of ruler. We just need to be close. We're going to just stretch some tape across the joints, and we are going to take this out. Make sure you apply some pieces of tape to the hanging off side so that when we fold it, you'll have something to grab. We very carefully want to flip this over and then make sure there is nothing inside of there. If you have an air compressor or just use your breath. Now, like I said, 3-to-1 water to glue. We're going to paint it on so it sinks in, pre-fill those pores. Some people don't believe in this. They just put the glue on and close it up. I've always done this. It's always worked. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I'm doing it every time anyways. We're going to mix up this mixture, and we want it closer to water than to glue. This should be runny. It should not have any kind of viscosity to it, and just paint it on there. Try not to put a ton of it on there. It's less sanding if less squirts out on the other side, and definitely try to avoid the interior here. We don't need to be perfect. We just want to cover, 85–90% of this. Actually, that's a question I've always had for anyone who knows. Does it matter if stain has spilled over the wood pores or just any wood for gluing together? I have glued together plenty of things with stain on them before. Obviously, I don't stress test everything, so I don't really know, but is there any reason to think that some stain spreading onto the inside will affect the ability of glue to adhere? Let me know. We don't need this running down everywhere. We just want to have it soaked in, and it will harden pretty Christ. Well, this is a prototype, so I'll survive. Apply the normal strength glue. Again, don't go wild with this. Just paint it on there. If any starts sinking in, come back and paint a little more on. My advice for sure is, if you're going to put a decent amount in there, don't put it right up until this line. When we close this, it will squeeze it inwards towards the inside of the box, and you will have to clean that up. So just paint some on the top and put the bulk of it a little lower, and it will naturally squeeze itself into place. Once you've gone all the way down and painted them, come back to the beginning. We want to see glue on the surface before we close this. So if you need to apply more, go ahead and do it. Don't go crazy, but there needs to be some visible glue on the surface everywhere. Now, before you fold this up, you need to decide, especially if your base is solid wood, which direction we want to have expansion, because we can, if we want, pin it. So for me, I want the grain running front to back. So obviously this way. And I am therefore then going to put, oh boy, a little bit of glue right in the dead middle of the back and right in the dead middle of the front. Just in the dead middle, maybe a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch wide. That's going to pin it in the middle, but we're going to get full expansion out to the sides, and we'll be totally fine. Obviously, this is sitting on a table, but it'll keep it from rattling around if it's a little loose. You can also just totally free float it if you want. We're going to go ahead and just slowly close this up. Oh, come on. Now, take your time and make sure this lines up nicely, and that the tape hasn't pulled it out of alignment. All right, now we definitely need to add a little more. Oh, that's too short. Whatever. What I ideally want is some tape pulling these front ones towards the back, and that is all done. We're gonna just leave that to sit and dry. I would definitely go overnight here, even though we are going to spline this. I don't want to take any chances. While this is drying, I want to move on to the arm thing, whatever we're gonna call it. And after a few prototypings off camera, I've finally come to a design that I'm happy with, I'm confident-ish in, and I think we're gonna go with it for this video. I had a lot of ideas in my mind of complicated, fabulous looking things, but they were just in my mind, and I couldn't work out a simple way to do them that I think would be a good video for people who don't have a ton of tools, aren't super experienced. I want this to be something that kind of anyone can build, right? Like, there's not a ton of complexity here. So I settled on this, although there's going to be one change, and it's going to be the length of this arm, because I realized in hindsight it's not long enough. So let's come in a little closer here, and I'll talk about what I was looking for, because I went with a few specific design criteria, and it'll be easier to show you rather than just tell you. All right, so my criteria was that I didn't want just some kind of rectangle glued onto the end of this. I wanted it to feel like it flowed in somehow. And I couldn't think of a way to flow to the sides without gluing up numerous pieces and then, I don't know, bevel cutting or carving out or something like that. It just seemed too complicated. So instead, I thought into my mind about how I could flow vertically. And I had this weird kind of memory back to a roller coaster I rode when I was a kid, where the chairs were suspended from the top, and it had this kind of like half U-shaped arm thing. And it struck me right then and there that that's a perfect way that we can flow into this box, so it's not just a rectangle stuck on the back, but we don't have to worry about getting thicker wood and then tapering it to the side. So this is what I'm gonna go with, though I think you can see probably it's a little short. However, I do not wanna go exactly to the middle, because we obviously want some hand room. I wanna go another 3/8 of an inch or so out. keeping it far enough back that you can still kind of reach your hands in, but middle enough that it'll still apply weight to any that move forward and could be pulled out accidentally. So we're going to make this in a few phases, and the first will just be the tracing out, and I'll give you the exact dimensions of mine, and then we'll deal with this little guy later. And for the finality of these top shapes, I'm not satisfied here, but we can deal with that later. It's just the general concept of weight coming down attached to the back, and I'm happy with the initial post structure. Post, that's what I'll call it, the post. So the only thing I am still a little unsure about, and maybe one of you can comment, is which way do we want the grain flowing here ideally? I've got it so that it's flowing so that this part is the strongest, and it doesn't feel like I could snap it, but I kept it 5/8 of an inch thick specifically for that. Should it be going this way, and should the grain be running up and down? I don't know. I just kind of went with the looks, and I like the idea of long grain up top instead of end grain, but that is a pure guess. I have no idea structurally which is better. If you do and you're doing this, then just turn the thing sideways if you need to do so. But I'm going to go with this same orientation, and that may be a bad idea. It may not be a bad idea. So the first thing here is that every section is 5/8 of an inch thick. I wanted some level of stability without too much chunkiness. The second is that from bottom to the beginning of our bend is 2.5 inches plus 1/4. I wanted it to stick up a little bit higher coming straight out rather than bending right away, but you can alter that if you wanted. And then I just went up at kind of a random angle, but in case you want to copy this exactly, it is about 68 degrees. I was just going purely off of aesthetics. I didn't take any prior measurements. And then again, I added a few little extra kind of softening of the edges to the front and back. I decided I actually like this kind of structured look more rather than something round, though I think for the right home and the right decor, something round may look better. So I'm going to mark all of this out, and then I'll give you a look at the measurements written onto here. I think that'll be easiest. Now, I apologize in advance for not being a CAD person or a fancy program person, at least not yet. So this is the best I'm able to do for you, but this is how I laid it out. The first thing we're going to do is the entire thing is going to be 4 3/8 of an inch tall. We will begin our bend at roughly 2 3/4 of an inch tall. We will then, this is pretty arbitrary down here, I just matched it to this. We maintain 5/8 of an inch thickness throughout this entire thing, and then this will be a 68-degree bend from this point right here, which is at 2 3/4. And all I did was connect the lines between the two 5/8 points. I just kind of went, it's again an arbitrary line. I just went from the left side up to the right side, and where they met was where my height is and the angle we had. Now I extended the length here out to 3 13/16 of an inch total. Now, depending upon the dowel size will depend upon where you drill. I'm going to make a 5/16 of an inch dowel by chucking some wood in a drill. So the center hole of that is going to be roughly 3/8 of an inch back from the edge. And I'm going to drill it whatever the next bit size I have oversized is, because we need it to move freely, of course. We obviously don't want it flopping, but it can't be a perfect 3/8 or 5/16 hole and 5/16 inch dowel, or it's not going to move smoothly. This entire piece I'm using is just a Home Depot undone anything to it piece of pine. So it's 3/4 of an inch thick stock. So pretty basic. You can obviously toy with the sizes you want. I will be doing this entire thing on the bandsaw mainly because I want to save everything from here over, so I'm just going to cut it out. I'm going to use my fence for a few of these cuts on the bandsaw. So this top one here, this inner one here, and then this straight down one to give me as close to a straight edge as possible with the bandsaw. And then the internal ones, I'm just going to freehand cut it out with the bandsaw and sand it. For those of you without a bandsaw, I'll walk you through how I would do this with, let's say, a jigsaw and a pull saw. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm cutting this board down to the correct width. Instead of having some overhang, I'm also leaving it long enough that I can get a couple clamps onto one end and hang this over my bench. I am then coming in with the pull saw or jigsaw and removing these two outer sections right here, leaving these angled and down. I am then coming in with a drill, and I'm putting a relief hole right here bigger than my jigsaw blade, a relief hole right here bigger than my jigsaw blade that ideally essentially touches up against the corners there. That allows us to have an escape route. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm coming up here with the jigsaw, I'm coming and making this turn. If you need a relief hole here to make this turn, have at it. Go ahead and do that. I am pulling the blade out at this point from here. I am coming over, I am inserting it into this relief hole, and I'm cutting straight down this way. Now everything here is cut off except for this cut holding it on, and I'm just taking a pull saw and going straight down with that. So if you have a jigsaw and a pull saw, ideally a drill as well, couple relief holes and do it outside in and you will be good to go. Now for those of you with a bandsaw, this is relatively straightforward. My only piece of advice for the order of operations is you have to choose whether to drill your hole first or drill it at the end. I did it both ways in prototyping. So the first time I took it and left it as a board and drilled straight through at the beginning. Therefore my hole was done when I cut it out. The second time I forgot to drill it at the beginning, but at the end you have this piece here that you can then just come straight down through here. It fit on the drill press just fine. A hand drill would work just fine, anything. So if you forget to cut it out or don't want to drill it out up front, you can certainly do it after. There's nothing really prohibiting you from being able to drill it out. It may be easier though to just drill it before and just set your depth gauge to just go right through it a little bit and it'll all be good. I did have to clamp this pretty solidly to my drill press table and fence to make sure it was straight up and down when I drilled through it because it's really light and there's not a lot of surface area to contact anything to hold it there. I'm going to go ahead and drill this hole first this time. I'm just doing my best to hit the dead center. We'll see what happens. If you have a large variety of drill bits, you can choose your dowel size, then drill over. If you don't have a ton of drill bits, pick a drill bit and then just make your dowel slightly smaller than that. I'm fortunate enough that I've collected a lot of drill bits over the years. So for me, I've got 11, 2164, something like that. So it's a little over 5/16. I think that sounds right. I also went to Harbor Freight today and replaced those two broken Bessie clamps with some more of these Pittsburgh, I think, clamps. It's unbelievable how cheap they are. Anyways, let's get this hole drilled. I'm going to put, I think, a light chamfer on all of this, but I don't want to make it look rounded because the whole idea of this aesthetic is that we have these sharp angles, but it's it's obviously sharp to the touch in that way that freshly cut wood edges. So I'm just going to lightly chamfer these things on the inside and all around too. Obviously, we want to be careful with this area here because this is going to be our glue surface. We don't want to take a ton of time and accidentally kind of rounding it over or anything like that. I was just trying to clean up a few bandsaw marks. That was it. This is still quite rough compared to everything else. So be careful with this one if you cut this on the bandsaw, not to sand it down to the point where it doesn't have any glue surface because it's all wobbly. I'm really happy with this. I am going to just do the kind of face sanding now, and then once that is dry from all the glue, I'm going to glue it on. I'm going to dowel it after I've glued it on. That way it's held in place. I don't have to worry about the drills pulling it or holes anywhere going like that. And then we will just make this little weight thing. What do I want to call this? The stick. Call it the stick. So the next day, this glued up pretty well. I don't see any gaps, so I'm super happy with that. If you have a bunch of gaps, you should spline this, especially at how tiny this is. You don't have to. If this was 3/4 of an inch in a prototype, I could be okay leaving it. If I think the people in my family are going to be pretty gentle, I'd be okay leaving it. If you got kids at all that may kind of yank on this thing, consider splining it. It's always nice to have a spline jig, so if you haven't built one yet, go ahead and do it. It's like 6 cuts, maybe something like that. It's not many to get it done. You just have to cut a couple 45s, that's it. So we're going to spline this. The first thing we need to do though is a little rough sanding. We're going to do our final sanding after the splines because we got to get them flush anyways and nice and cleaned up. But we need to make sure this is relatively flat on the bottom, mainly for it's sitting flat on the table and not rocking around all the time, but also for alignment in the spline jig. It'll just line them up better if when we turn this every direction, they're all on the same plane. I guess that's what we call it. So if need be, put this on a flat-ish surface. A lot of times the surface isn't flat, so it's not possible to tell, but flattest surface, usually your table saw top. And if it's not flat, put some 150 grit, something low, on some 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch MDF, just some spray glue. Clamp it down and just do a little bit of that. It'll be flat in no time. And then after we do that, I'm gonna do kind of like rough to just 150 sanding just to take some pencil marks off and stuff like that. We're gonna do the vast majority of our sanding after this. I just wanna get the glue off now, anything like that that's spilled over. If you're not doing splines, you don't wanna build a spline jig, you don't feel comfortable doing it, whatever, you can just skip ahead till after that part where I talk about putting this on, and then we'll then talk about making this little middle thing, because I'm still torn on that a little bit as to the overall shape of things. I also want to mention for rough sanding, do not take this top and put it down and start going back and forth in a straight line. You will leave horrific gouge grooves in 2 of these 4 sides because they're running in entirely different directions. All of that is going to either have to be hand sanded, which is why we took really good care to make sure it was pretty close to flush before, or very careful random orbit sander of some type. If you start going at this thing in one direction, it is going to be a real tough time getting those cross grain sanding grits out of the 2 sides that are not going in that way. So we're going to do our best not to do that. I've done that before. It's not fun. Just wanted to give you a little sneak peek of how this is going to look once we get it all together. I'm really happy with it. I'm happy with the distance back from the front of the napkins, allowing a full hand to get in there. And I think the decision to put this bottom bevel on to make it flow in was absolutely great. Now for the spline layout, we have a little bit of choice. On this front side, we're only probably putting 1. If yours is 3/4 of an inch tall, you have no concerns and you'll definitely clear the base. I think I'm gonna clear it if I go directly in the middle, but of course we don't go all the way through. We only set the table saw blade height, which we'll do at the table saw, to only go a partial way through. So I think I'll be okay. So I'm obviously gonna put 1 dead in the middle here, and then I'll carry that all the way around, and that'll be our first one. But then on the back here, we get to decide roughly what the spacing is. I usually like to either split it evenly throughout, or to do 3 and 1 is kind of on its own, or to do kind of an off number. So like 2, 1, or 1, 2, something like that. Just to, when it draws the eye to it, there's just a little something going on there. But you can just perfectly evenly split them too, and it will be perfectly fine. Now, if this is one of your early times doing a spline jig, don't forget that when you go over to line it up, it really helps to have the line carried up further so that you can see it when you're on there. But if you've done it before, you'll know that. And if you haven't done it before, trust me, carry the line up further and you'll find out why. I have decided to go 2 on the outsides, 1 in the dead middle. So obviously the one I have to have is going to be in the middle of the 5/8. If yours is 3/4, you're going to go 3/8. And then I took that, which is then 5/16, spaced another one 5/16, mirrored that on the top, and then I just split the difference down the middle. I think that'll look cool. Who knows? It's a prototype. If you don't like it, change it however you wish. All you need to do here is just get at least a couple splines in there, 2 on the back, 1 in the front. Will work out well. Now, the determination of the depth of our splines is based on the blade height here, and it determines 2 things. Obviously, how deep in there and how much glue surface we have, as well as how far out they're going to come on the sides. The deeper you go, as in the higher your blade is, the further out they will show on either side. If you just want tiny little ones, don't go very deep at all. What we do not want to do is go past this entire joint here and cut through open to the middle. We would like it somewhere under that. I usually just go about halfway, a little over half or a little under half. So that's gonna be my blade height right about there, just around halfway. This is by far the most awkward thing I've ever splined in my life. And it's gonna be weird when we're on this. We don't have a ton to balance on, but I'm gonna go with it anyways. I'm gonna line it up on a different side and then rotate it there. I use just things to kind of give me something to hold on to and keep it in alignment. And then I just clamp it down to there. I do like building jigs, but there are times where I think if I won the lottery, Woodpeckers makes an amazing kind of version of this, of aluminum, and it's got stop blocks and it's got this open thing so you can change the angles. And I'm very happy with mine, but boy, would it be nice to just have it all like easily built in and not have to kind of do all these clamping measures. Anyway, I'll stop complaining. I'm very lucky the situation I'm in. So the way I'm going to do this here is I'm going to do all 4 bottom ones first, And then I only have to do these back two. So I can rotate, and as long as I keep it straight up against there, I will still be in line. Even though I don't have something to push against on this side, I should be okay. So we're gonna get those two outer ones done with first before we move to the next ones. All right, this is a good teaching moment because I almost flubbed big time here. All right, turns out if you go any more than half, we're gonna overshoot this bevel right here. I just barely cleared it. So when I said earlier to go half depth or anything over that, do not go over that. If you're using 7/16 of an inch, half at max, or else we end up cutting into this, which I should have known because I specifically explained that that's how far out it goes is the depth. Anyways, we're gonna survive. We've made it. Okay, and all of the low ones and the first two tops are done. At this point, you're just going to continue aligning it up to your next ones and go all the way through however many you want. If you want to stop at that, that's totally fine too. Now, when it comes to cutting the material to actually put the spline in the spline cut, I guess we'll call it that, I am a bandsaw guy. Some people will just dial in the table saw. It's a lot of trial and error until you get the right fit. We want it tight enough that it doesn't like shake out if we were to slide it in and shake the box a bit, but we don't want to have to mount it in there, especially on relatively fragile areas. We want just a firm pressure kind of fit, and I will show you. Now, some people set the table saw up, dial it in, and batch out a ton of them. I've always just found the bandsaw to be quicker and easier, and you can either cut a little over and hand plane down, cut a little over, sand down, or honestly, I usually just stick them in straight from the bandsaw and the compression and glue just kind of fills it in. You would never know that there's a rough kind of bandsaw cut on the side. Obviously, the lower tooth count the blade is, the rougher it is. This is a 6 TPI. It works perfectly fine, so I just do that. I've got a piece of walnut with a nice internal crack down the middle, so I figure even though on this prototype, I'll go with that instead. This is the fit we are looking for right here. Press fit in, not coming out, not going anywhere, but I don't have to mallet it in there. Again, this is going to be fragile up in this area, and you're going to need probably 3 times the length of this, so maybe 25 inches to cover this. The deeper you went and the wider they are, the more material you'll need. And width-wise, just check based on the height of your saw blade to get something. I like it to hang over some. We're gonna flush trim these off afterwards. I've only got a couple small things to say about putting the splines in. The first is we wanna cover all of the surface area with glue internally. So I use a pick and I kind of paint it on in there. You want everything covered, but you don't need a ton of glue in there. What we do want to see though is that when we place these in there, that glue squirts out the 2 sides, even if it's just a tiny bit. That means we've seated it all the way. One of the worst things that can happen is when you put it all the way, or you put it in there and it doesn't go all the way, and then by the time you flush trim it, you've got a noticeable spot, especially if you're using contrasting woods like a maple box and a walnut spline. You'll notice this gap and it doesn't look good. So we want to make sure they're fully seated and we're getting some squeeze out on either ends. Again, I said, if you're gonna mallet these at all, please be very careful. Support this somehow and just a little tapping. If you're struggling to get it, if it fits nicely, but you put glue in and you're struggling to get it in there, it's possible you've put too much glue in, but what you can do is just lightly feather taper the back edges of these so that it gives some of that glue room to kind of escape as you put it in there. And if you do it just light enough, it won't be noticeable, but it'll give a little room for that glue to come out. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Just be very careful. The strength added to these is integral if we have something relatively thin that is going to get a lot of use. In this case, not a ton of like weight moving or anything like that, but it's going to help. When you're done, give these about an hour before you start trimming them off. Most glues have that kind of initial set time around an hour. So before we do any kind of machining or anything to them and apply pressure, we want to just let them get that initial set time. And then of course they'll cure over the next 24 hours or so, but don't be impatient. Just let these sit for an hour. It's time to trim these off, and I only have 2 tips here. The first is if you have a bandsaw, you're going to be tempted to go there, and that's fine. Just be prepared for 2 things. The first is that when you're normally cutting something on the bandsaw, the table is under it and it gets pulled down in. With these top ones here, there's nothing under it, and the bandsaw can just sometimes slam them down on the table. It's extremely loud and they can come flying. So obviously eye protection, and just be prepared for it because it's a little startling in real time. Go slow, be deliberate. And then that same advice, slow and deliberate, applies to the flush trim saw. The kind of inside tips at the end of the miter are so fragile with these, especially if your glue was not spread well enough and there's not actually any adhesion right at the end. They will chip out. They will chip out and tear out, and it's just kind of not particularly great aesthetically. So be very careful. I personally like to come in from the side with my little flush trim saw. That way I'm avoiding pulling out that area altogether. This is what I mean by coming in from the outside. So I'm finishing my cut this way towards more of the wood rather than out. As I'm doing my final sanding pre-stain here, I'm gonna do something I shouldn't do. But I was a little messy when I stained this, and I got some on the side, and I don't need to get it all off because I'm obviously putting stain over, but I'd like to get some of it off so it doesn't look super dark there. I'm also getting tired and I'd like to get this done, so I'm gonna do this with the random orbit sander, but don't do this if you're tempted. It's almost certainly gonna round this over, and that's what I don't want. If this was not the prototype, I would sit here by hand and do this, but I'm tired and I want to get the stain on this tonight. All right. Yeah, the bevel's still there. We're still consistent. All right, I'm gonna put the stain on this then, and we'll come back tomorrow, or I'll come back tomorrow, and we will attach our little hangy thing. Everything is done except now for making this little plunger guy. And once we've got that made, we're gonna glue on the back, and then we can do a finish. I like keeping this off while I'm making this so I can do the test fit. If it's on there, it's a little awkward. You gotta keep popping on and off the top. Now, experimentally so far, I've just gone with a 3/4 by 3/4 cube. I think that's a good starting spot, though the shape here is really totally up to you. You could go with something wider, some kind of plunger handle. I'm working on currently some kind of many-sided thing that's not a sphere, but is kind of like a dice, as close as I can get to a many-sided dice. I think my dream, though, and I don't know how to do part of this, would be to be a nice sphere on top. I don't have a lathe of any sort. A sphere on top, and then some kind of like pyramid on the bottom that comes down into a point. I think that would look really cool. But I'm happy with this guy so far as the closest thing I can get to a sphere. I'll bring you in a little closer to look at this. And again, this is all imagination for you. I do drill the hole first. So I just drilled into a piece of pine, which I'm using to build this, and then cut out 3/4 by 3/4 around that because it's incredibly tiny. So this is my little guy so far. Again, I pre-drilled a hole in there, not super deep, maybe a 1/4 inch, just enough to get some glue adhesion. And then I took this to the bandsaw. It started out as this, and I just started trimming off every edge on there. Then I went to the belt sander and just kind of pressed it down a little bit on every side. Again, a sphere would be ideal in my opinion. I don't know how to make those. This is not the cleanest thing ever. It's a little tricky on a belt sander with something this small, but that's what I'm going with. I laid this out to give myself 4 different chances from the start. I just drilled them all at once. Therefore, if I make mistakes on shaping them, I've got a bunch of blanks already made. If it takes you setup time to do all this, do a bunch at once. Worst case scenario, you toss away a few 3/4 by 3/4 blocks. So I'm drilling, and then I'm gonna just slice them all out of there. Setting the depth to, I don't know, a little over a 1/4 inch, 5/16, something like that. I'm just gonna go over the process I used to make this little guy in case you're interested at all. So we've got something that roughly resembles the shape, and it gives us kind of just a guide here. This is by far the sketchiest part in my opinion, because if this thing grabs, it wants to just fly right off. So if you're gonna do this, hold on tight. If I didn't have this, I'd drag this along sandpaper by hand, but it's not one of those things where I paid for the tool, I'm gonna use it. Otherwise though, I would just glue sandpaper down to a piece of MDF and just drag along. All right, the first one was a total failure. I way overcooked it on one of the sides and it shot across the room at least 2 times. So I'm gonna start this over, and I think I'll try this next one by hand, just dragging it along, because it's very startling when this goes flying across the room and probably not safe. On attempt number 2, I will be taking the less sketchy, albeit slower, and more deliberate method. So I guess I'm not going to be lazy, and I'm just going to do this by hand because I don't really want to do that again. The only problem with this is you got to get a low grit to remove the material, then a high grit because it leaves it rough. We're going cross grain on some of this. I don't usually like to admit when I'm wrong, but doing it by hand only took like 3 more minutes. It never flew across the room, and I'd actually argue it's more even and looks better than on the machine. So I'm very happy with how these turned out. Again, this is a prototype. I'd probably pay a little more attention. You can see I've got an angle off right there, but I'm going to get these stained, and they're going to be my weights and lever pull. The only thing left to construct is the dowel that's going to connect the 2 points and lift up and down. Now, this is a problematic in that it's an external dowel. Most common dowel making methods, whether it's drilling through a plate or punching it through a plate or hammering it through a plate, they leave a pretty rough, messy dowel. We need this to look good. It's going to be external. It's going to be seen. It's going to be obvious. So we can't have that roughness to it. So how do you get around this problem? Well, I don't know, except for this janky method I made years ago. There's something I make that requires about 40 or 50 sections of 3/16 inch external dowels. So I had to come up with something to make smooth, small, tiny dowels. I've made thousands of them. I have a ton of dowel stock lying around. What you do is you decide on the hole you're going into. You cut a piece out that's a foot long or less, and that's key for safety reasons. And you cut it square slightly over the diameter that you would like to have. You then take it, in my method here, remember this is not like gospel, this is just how I do it. You shove it in the drill, you clamp the drill down, and we are essentially trying to make a kind of jerry-rigged little lathe thing here. You will then need some method to clamp the trigger down. I use this. However, if you have a nice drill or a drill you care about at all, this thing just chews away the rubber grip. This is a many years old rigid drill. At this point, I don't care, but I destroyed it originally doing this. So some other method, maybe some rubber bands, I don't know, some kind of zip tie, something like that may help. And I just step up through the grits. I start with like 60, 80, 100, then I go up to 150, then 220, and I finish at 400. You can finish wherever you want, and I just get it with the low grit to where it's visually round. And then I'm just looking to kind of finesse it into the right size. Okay, so we're close, right? We take it out, we grab the thing, and we check the front, and it fits our hole nicely. We think we're done. Maybe. What you're then going to think you're going to do is you're going to chop it off at the distance you want, the length you want, and stick it in the other hole. Hold on a sec, because what often happens is you've got this thing in there, you're not able to take away a perfectly even amount. So in almost every single one I've ever made, the front end ends up thinner than the back. And you'll get the front end to fit. Sometimes you actually overshoot it. And you go and cut it, and then the back is thicker. And it's very hard to get that thinner, because what we can't really do is just turn this around and shove it in there, because you'll notice it leaves jaw marks on the wood. So we can't just turn it around, stick it all the way in, and go again. So what I do, or have done, by now I know by sight what a 3/16 inch dowel looks like. I take another piece of wood that's like 5/16 of an inch thick. Whatever hole I'm trying to go into, I take that drill bit, I drill straight through it. I then take a little bit of sandpaper and I widen that hole just a little bit, and I bevel the entrance. And what I'm looking for is that when that dowel can go through there with me pushing, I don't want it to fall through, with me pushing, then I know that this hole is slightly oversized, and therefore when I cut it, the other end will fit the hole I want to. You've got to make sure that when you cut it, you know pretty darn well that the back half of your piece is going to fit. Calipers will work fine too if you want to go that route. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you've got a different method for external dowel making where it leaves the dowel looking nice, please let me know. I would pay money to not have to do this anymore. It takes me a long time. I've made well over 1,000 of them, and I hate it. Time to get this project across the finish line. Now, the next step is to glue this on. However, I do want to say, if you are planning to brush any type of film finish on there, it's going to be a little awkward once this is glued on to get in those kind of corners. So you may want to tape off a section, brush the film finish on the rest of it, and then once that's dry and ready, then you can glue this on, or even pre-finish this and then glue it on. That kind of thing right there. I don't want anybody to glue this on and then struggle to finish inside of these corners. For me, if this was unstained wood on like kind of the non-prototype one, I would probably just oil it. I'm gonna just spray lacquer some on this. I'm sure I'll end up putting this in the house and using it somewhere. I'm not gonna throw it away, I don't think. But I'm gonna also do this in 2 stages because I wanna drive 2 dowels through the back, not all the way through the whole thing, but just in there for a little extra support. But I want to glue this on and have this dry first, so then I can go to the drill press or the hand drill and just kind of stand it up and drill straight through. I don't want to try to align this at the same time because it's very easy to get this guy kind of crooked here. Now my way of doing this is going to be to measure and find center and then find kind of the equal sides on either side. I'm going to go in, I'm going to get it square, and then I'm going to hold that, and I'm going to apply and clamp one on either side of it so that I essentially have a perfect alignment, kind of like so that when I apply the glue, I come in, I can just go like that. I'm going to apply wood glue and super glue. I'm going to hold it for, 30 seconds, and then I got these baby little clamps the other day at Harbor Freight. I'm going to use this and I'm just going to clamp it on, and I'm going to leave it for a few hours at least before I dowel through it. 2 things to remember here. The first is that while we normally like to see a little squeeze out on a glue joint, we'd like to not see it here because that's going to be tricky to get in there, especially if you stain something. So ideally, since we're doweling this as well, you don't need to go crazy with the glue here. In fact, I'm going to wait for this to tack a little bit so that ideally less comes out, and then I'm going to do a little super glue in the corners just to help hold it on until I can get a clamp there. The second thing is that if you followed my exact design, there is a space here that sticks above the back. So do not put glue all the way up this flat side. You need to leave a portion of this without glue on. Other than that though, however you want to glue this on, have at it. I think my way is gonna work pretty well. I don't know, we'll see. Oh boy, do I have a lot of squeeze out. Oh my God. That's so bad. Oh, I better get this off of here. It's gonna glue it to that. Oh God. Okay. Well, it's the prototype. I'm gonna get a chisel and clean that out. That's so bad. I don't use my big chisels a lot, but much like the Foo Fighters said, it's for times like these. Now this would be borderline disastrous if I was oiling this, because that oil is not gonna sink into that, but a spray will go over this and it'll be okay. All right, I'm gonna let that dry for a few hours before I dowel it. I may try to add one more clamp across the bottom thing, but be careful, don't squeeze this too tight. We don't wanna crack these relatively fragile, albeit reinforced joints. This has sat for a few hours, so I am comfortable now drilling through it. This is a great time if you've got a drill press to use it. This is why I went with the 12-inch one of the Wen model, which has been great for me. It's so I can fit relatively tall things under here. I am going to use 3/16 of an inch dowels purely because I have a bunch lying around. For the final project, I will use 2 5/16 to match the diameter of the plunger. I think matching it will look nice. I'm not going to go all the way through, but it could be an interesting aesthetic to go all the way through and have dowels sticking out from, or not sticking out, but visible from both sides. However you want to do it, that's fine. You could definitely do this by hand as long as you can clamp this to something, perhaps bring it up a little higher, set something to stop your depth for when you're drilling, whether it's just tape on there or one of those little collets so you don't go through if you don't want to. So that should, not having a drill press shouldn't be a big problem here. It's just nice to have it. And in my method for clamping this is the best I could come up with on the fly, is going to be putting this in here like that and just using a squeeze clamp to go around. That seems to work for me. It's the one downside of floating a base is that you have this little gap here. I also consider sometimes using something on the back and the front so that none of it is being pulled, but I think it'll be okay in this situation. I only need one thing clamped there so that I can hold the other side and do the drilling down. I'm gonna go ahead and glue these in here. I only have one tip. One, put plenty of glue in there. Two, when you cut these, either do it right away before the glue starts to set or wait like an hour or something. Don't glue them all in there, then come back like 30 minutes later when that glue, we want it to be setting and that contact to be firm. So either put them in, glue them in, flush trim right away, or wait a little while and come back after an hour, 2 hours, something like that. We don't want to be in that middle period when we don't want to be moving around the wood. I was wondering if somebody could tell me, with flush trim saws, are they truly supposed to be fully flush? Because this isn't expensive. It's a Sweezen, I don't know, 20 some dollars. And it's an almost flush trim saw in my experience. And is that my technique? Is that just how they work? I always have to do either some sanding or some chiseling to get them actually flush. Now, admittedly, in hot, humid times, a previously flush dowel can kind of swell a bit, but I like to at least get them flush when I am building the project. So I'm going to attempt to do the impossible here, though I'm going to try it, of kind of just shaving these flush without damaging the stain at all. So we're going to see how this goes. There's not a whole lot there, but it's enough that I can feel it with my finger. Oh man, we may actually pull this off. And that's why we flatten the back of our chisels so that we can reference it off and not gouge into wood. For all intents and purposes, this project is done. We just have to do some finishing, slot this through and glue it in there. Awesome. Now I'm gonna spray this. I mentioned earlier, though I know people skip around. I'm gonna spray lacquer it. This is just a prototype. If this was not stained and it was like a solid hardwood of some type, I would just be oiling this, I think. But make sure, if you are going to spray or do anything other than just a basic oil, to finish this separately, finish this whole thing, and then slide it in there and glue it. If this thing is in there and stuck and it's in your way when you're trying to like spray or paint, it's going to drive you insane. So put this in at the very end. If you're oiling it, I guess you can put it in now, whatever, fine. But if you're doing anything other than like a linseed oil or something like that, do not put this in first. It will be in your way. And also, do not glue these two together until you've got it in there. All right. So yeah, don't glue it together before you get it in there. And here we have the final piece, the napkin holder, the prototype for me. I'm very happy with how it turned out. There were some mistakes made. A little bit of rushing along the way caused some issues, but I'm gonna now take this design, make it out of nicer wood, and spend a little more time kind of refining everything. I was in a rush, and when I applied the lacquer on the outside, I got a little dribble over, trying to just do too many coats at once, you know, typical thing. The main thing I forgot, and I don't know how I forgot this because I mentioned it in so many videos, I didn't pre-finish the inside. So there's a little buildup inside the corners because I was trying to spray inside and around. I should have just painted some lacquer on originally before I glued it together. So if you are doing this, and I will insert something in before the glue up, and you are doing any kind of film finish, do the interior before you glue it up. I'm pretty sure I said to do the base, which is weird because then I forgot to say to do the walls. Anyways, overall, I'm quite happy. I think this is perfectly fine in terms of the height of the dowel for the napkins. I don't know if you'd ever put that many in there, but maybe you would. Overall, good with the dimensions, good with the size. This is why I built it slightly oversized, right? Because it's hard to keep napkins in a perfect stack. So I wanted a little bit of wiggle room on either side. But you can see why it's important to have this kind of pushing down because they can't just fall out. They're kind of lightly trapped in there, but you can still obviously pull out a single napkin if you wish to do so. And if you need to add more, you just lift, give them a little tap, and we're good to go there. The other thing I really wish I'd done in hindsight is I wished before I glued the back on, and I may have mentioned this as an option, but again, I was just moving too fast. It's prototype. I should have taped off the middle here. I should have sprayed the back and then put that on. Again, another problem with spray is sometimes you get buildup in the creases. I put too much glue on there and had some squeeze out, and even though I got most of it, it's a little noticeable from the right angle. I also made the mistake of not finishing the underside of this ahead of time. I wasn't thinking about the shape of this fully when I had it all glued together. So the underside of this little piece I just left because I don't want to drip and spill trying to get under there. But overall, as a functional piece and the overall aesthetic, I'm very happy. I think actually in hindsight, 3/4, my original plan would have been perfect, but I'm okay with 5/8. It's not a disaster. It just gets a little harder to work with super thin pieces, especially for the glue up. But whether you offcut or miscut a little bit, if you're under 3/4, you're still going to be perfectly fine with the outcome here in terms of functionality and aesthetic. Here is a closer up look at the napkin holder. We can see going in there. Overall, I'm fairly happy with the height, like I said, even though it's shorter than I would like. But I think it's a cool design. I think the back looks pretty good. You can see if you go with a contrasting dowel, you get a nice little look there. Very pleased. All right, thanks for joining me. And if you have any questions, let me know. Bye.